This really quick. Bao Nguyen, welcome. So good to see you again. It's been many a year.
Many years, Duane. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Welcome to Utah Valley University digitally. It looks like we have about 40 people in the house here. And I'm just going to make a few kind of protocol announcements here. I want you guys to show your camera. So Bao isn't talking to a bunch of black squares with names. And also, if you have questions for him, and hopefully there's a lot of them, you just write your name in the chat. You don't need to write the question. Just give me your name. Please give me your full name so that I know who you are. Thank you for jumping in on a Q&A. You're in LA now, so it's not so late. It's always when we're dealing with New Yorkers, it's always like 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock when we're doing this, and they're like, what? But it's great to have you. The movie's fantastic. It's so perfect, and it's really beautiful. I want to ask two questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the guys here. The first is, when did it happen, and how did it play out that you went from thinking it would be cool to make a Bruce Lee documentary to suddenly making what's going to be like the definitive Bruce Lee documentary? Where was that bridge?
Well, thank you again for having me here to speak, and thank you all for joining and watching. I see Go Nakamura, who's the composer. Go's here. So Go was the composer of the film. So nice surprise.
Hold on. I got to change my view here to find Go. Go, where are you, man? Hey, it's Go Nakamura.
Duane.
Hey, man, good to see you. Yeah, Bao, I'd lost contact. I'd lost your email, and he hooked us up. So I thought I'm going to send him the link in case he wants to sit in. Those of you who have taken Cinematography 1 might recognize Go, because Bill Otto always shows daylight savings as in class as an example of great work and phenomenal acting. And tell people really quick, you did some of the composing in the film, right?
Yeah, scored it in this room here.
Fantastic. All right, such a great film. Okay, now I got to find Bao again.
Yeah. Okay.
There you are.
Hi. So I'll your question about so I'm always wary of calling any film, especially documentaries, the definitive documentary about any subject. I think there's a certain person with the initials KB who thinks that he makes films that are definitive, and I think it's a little presumptuous to do that. But I mean, after my first feature documentary, which was about Saturday Night Live, it was sort of looking at Saturday Night Live through an anthropological lens. I wanted to do another film about sort of an American icon and unpack the icon in a different way. As an Asian American, as a child of refugees, I was born and raised in America, but I think my perspective on certain familiar subjects of American culture lends itself for, a reshifting of the narrative, sometimes different perspective. And with Bruce Lee, I think for the most part, people knew his name or know his name, but they don't really know Bruce Lee as a person, and they know him as a mythology and as almost a kung fu god, right? And the purpose of Be Water was in a way to unpack that mythology. This was a time, the idea for the film came at a time where there were a lot of, biographical documentaries. The Amy Winehouse documentary had just won the Oscar, and that was something, people have seen that film. There are it's sort of an homage to Asif's type of style of filmmaking where it's all archival. And I enjoy the idea of immersing yourself entirely in the visual story of your subject, right? And then feeling like you're in that time period. And so, yeah, it came as an idea, and then it was a 5-year process. It wasn't easy. The Bruce Lee family was a little hesitant at first because a lot of people approach the family about, I have this idea to do a Bruce Lee film. Sure. And for good reason, they're a bit protective. And I think for me, again, as an Asian American, Bruce Lee's story hasn't really been told through the Asian American lens. This was the first feature documentary that was directed by an Asian American. I think you can sort of see that stamp in the film and that perspective that I wanted to tell. Again, Bruce Lee, again, the name is very iconic, but him as an Asian American in 1960s America is not a narrative that's usually sort of centered, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think that as a filmmaker, sorry, I should just so kind of pretext the things, just the class is it a production class? Is it a cinema studies class or?
This is a mix. This is a mix. So
Okay.
this is an event that's associated with a class, but it's also a lot of these students are juniors and seniors, part of that class that it's associated with. But I would say the majority of them are just students from other classes and just people checking it out. So
Okay, great. Sometimes I'm just like, maybe I should talk more about the production and things, or
well,
sort
that
of
would be
the
great. That'd be
cinema.
great.
But yeah, I mean, I'll let you sort of ask the question, Duane. But yeah, I mean, I think that was the purpose of the film, is to have a certain voice. For me as a director, I want to make films that feel that it's my voice, even though I don't literally have my voice in the film, but people know the film and say, okay, I was guided by a director through that story, and I felt like I was in good hands in many ways. There's a lot of films where you're like, okay, they had great material and anyone could have made that film, but I try not to do those type of films.
Right. Well, great, thank you. How did you, I mean, talk a little bit more. You said that the Lee family was was protective, but eventually, like Shannon opened up and shared these very personal private letters with you, which I'm sure you didn't know existed at the time. I mean, how is it that you were able to, I mean, maybe you could walk us through it a little more about how that process worked of not just like getting their permission, but really winning their trust. I mean, you did say as an Asian American filmmaker, that was a part of it, but go a little deeper if you would.
Sure, it's a long story, so I'll try to condense it a bit. When I first approached her, again, she was hesitant because there had been many documentaries made about her father, and she's like, what can be added to the story that hasn't been told before? And I told her, again, as I haven't seen a story that was told entirely by people who knew your father, that was through, again, the story of an Asian American immigrant, really pushing that narrative more, and just feeling more immersed in Bruce's life and his voice, right? So that was the beginning of the conversation. She was developing another series, Warrior, which is now on HBO Max, and so she was busy, but I was persistent, and there was a bit of time where we felt like we didn't hear back from her for literally years. But my producer, and this is, you should always, for any directors out there, try to find a producer who will always vouch for you, who will always push you, right? And when I sort of thought this film wasn't going to be made because we weren't going to get the permission of the family, my producer Julia Nottingham was like always pushing me, and she was the one who thought to approach ESPN, because they weren't, the film itself, or Bruce Lee, isn't sort of your prototypical sports story.
Right.
And she had a good relationship with ESPN, and she's like, well, they're not looking for the prototypical sports story. They want something where sports can be in the foreground at first, but then sort of transition to the background of a larger social narrative. And that's exactly the type of film I wanted to make. And actually, those are the 30 for 30 episodes that I'm drawn to the most, right? Like OJ Made in America and things like that. And after a conversation with ESPN, they were, they jumped on board. They loved the idea, and they sort of loved the take. And they actually didn't need most of the other sort of financiers, broadcasters that we approached. They're like, oh, do you have the approval of the Lee family? And we had conversations with them, but we didn't have anything on paper necessarily. And ESPN was like, well, we don't need permission. I mean, we made OJ Made in America without OJ's permission, right? And I was like, well, that's
A
very
little different.
helpful. Yeah, a little different, but I knew at the end of the day I wanted, I should say that Shannon Lee, his daughter, wasn't a producer on the film. She only watched the final cut of the film a week before it, premiered. So she wasn't sort of hands-on. She, to be honest, she has sort of her reputation precedes her in the industry that she's very protective, that there's very few Bruce Lee projects because she's sort of the gatekeeper. But that being said, I knew at the end of the day, I couldn't tell a personal story of Bruce Lee's life without having the stories of Linda, his widow, and his daughter, Shannon, and also obviously the archives and the letters and the writings and the photographs and everything, a lot of things that we see in the film. And I just went along making the film as best as I could without necessarily having their permission. And once I got into a place where I felt, it was ready to talk to her about and interview her, that's when I reapproached her. And to be honest, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out and we were editing the film, and we were editing the film in London, and everyone messaged me because of that infamous Bruce Lee scene. If people have seen the film, they're like, have you seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. And I was busy editing a film. So I was like, I don't have time to go to a movie theater. But I just got inundated with these messages. And then Shannon had written something like in the Hollywood Reporter, just saying how offended she was by the portrayal of her father by Tarantino. And not to sort of be conniving about it, but I knew that if that was the narrative that Hollywood was going to perpetuate about Bruce Lee, then Be Water is a counter narrative that we can, for me personally, I could present. And I messaged her and I was like, oh, hey, I heard what about the film XYZ, and she was ready to set up the interview like a month later after that. And so I thank you to Quentin Tarantino for that.
Very interesting. Yeah. I'm glad
and again, it was like the film.
Up.
Yeah, the film is not a point by point, like, again, reaction to Once Upon a Time. And and we actually we were almost done editing at that point. It was like we needed Shannon to sort of fill in a lot of blanks that we needed to tell the story in a most efficient way, I should say.
Well, and I have one other question that will lead to a bunch of other people here who are texting me there or chatting their names. Let me just mention this. It was very significant for me watching this again today after last night, or Monday night, I guess it was. And with your whole sequence about the history of racism against Asian Americans in this country, and then to have this play out against our news right now is really sort of extra powerful. So I think it's great timing for us to watch this film. So let me ask you about the really brilliant ending with the portraits, and the choice to never have the talking heads throughout the film, which I think is just such a revolutionary approach and so like artfully crafted. When did that come about? How did it come about? Was it a result of something or what?
I would say I came up, I made that decision at the beginning of the process. I didn't tell my producer that because I wanted to shoot the interviews, because otherwise she's like, oh, well, we can save so much money because we'll just do audio interviews. But I knew that the poignancy of seeing them at the end was really important. As I mentioned before, the film is about trying to immerse the viewer in Bruce Lee's time, meaning 1960s America, 1970s Hong Kong. And I find personally, when I watch a documentary, especially about sort of a historical subject or historical figure, when you jump from, say, like 1960s archival footage to like a modern day studio talking head interview, it's really jarring, right? You really feel like, okay, you're you're no longer in the time period in the story. And because of that, I decided not to show the interviews, because you're jumping from you're seeing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar when he's like in his 20s, and then all of a sudden you're cutting to him when he's like 80 something, right? And it just doesn't feel right. And I knew at the end that when Bruce Lee passes away and we sort of transport ourselves into our present day, that's when we see these interviews. And the idea of like showing the photographs and then showing the interview subjects was another idea that came up early, because I wanted to create that intimate personal connection between who was speaking the whole time and their connection to Bruce Lee. Because there's been a lot of documentaries where you have like, I don't want to discredit past documentaries, but I'll just say there's one where like they talk to Ed O'Neill, right? Al Bundy from Married with Children, about Bruce Lee. And I'm like, what authority does Al Bundy have to talk about Bruce Lee in a documentary, in a way? And that, most of those films are about Bruce Lee's legacy and after he died. And again, I wanted to almost, humanize the myth, I should say.
Yeah.
So then, when you see Linda, you see Kareem when they're like in their 70s, 80s, a few audience members have told me that they also imagine what Bruce Lee would look like today, right, in his 80s. And I think that sort of cinematic language was important to me to make viewers and the audience have that same imagination.
And this is just a beautiful idea. It works so well. So I'm going to turn it over to people. And please, when you tell me your name and like what year you are in school or something like that, so you get some context here. Annie McAllister is our first person. Where are you, Annie? Are you with us still?
Yeah, I'm here. I actually don't have a question yet. I might have accidentally.
Oh, okay. You don't have a question, Annie? Oh, okay.
I mean, I just loved it. I could just comment that it was beautiful and it made me cry several times, and I thought it was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Annie.
We'll move on to Saul.
Hi, Bao. And hi, Go. So I'm Saul Castillo. I'm a senior here at UVU, wanting to focus on directing and writing. I guess my question would be, were you at all intimidated by the fact that you set out to do a documentary about Bruce, who was arguably the most influential Asian American in film history? And were you afraid that this was a project that was never going to come to fruition?
Well, thank you, Sal, for the question. I think, yeah, I mean, he's not even Asian American film history, but Asian American history, right? I mean, you can't really think of anyone that's on his level. I was worried about it in, certain parts of the production, but I kind of shifted that burden into a privilege. I realized it was a privilege to be able to tell the story of Bruce Lee in the way that I wanted to tell it. Not many filmmakers have that privilege, and that made it a little easier to make the film, right, by shifting the idea of responsibility and burden to privilege. And I knew that if I made a film that again was reflective of my voice as a filmmaker, my voice as an Asian American filmmaker, then people couldn't I mean, obviously people can be critical of it, but I always sort of follow the motto when I make films of like, it's not the question of how I made something, but the why. And every choice I make in the film, I'm able to defend. And that makes it a little easier. And I think people have the right to different opinions about the film. It's, again, we're making art, right? And it's subjective. And so I don't try to get too defensive when someone doesn't like something, but I can can defend my choice, but I'm not gonna sort of attack and criticize their preference of it.
Okay, all right, yeah. I mean that's really great to hear. I think that you did a fantastic job here, and you know I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you.
Oh, and good job on the soundtrack, and I loved you in Daylight Savings.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's sort of a cult favorite because Bill includes it. The very first time I found out about it, though, I have to say, I share this with everyone. Some of our female students came up to me and said, "Duane, we saw you in that movie that Bill shows in his class." And I said, "Which one?" He says, "Daylight Saving." And I said, "You mean the one when I'm in my underwear?" And they said, "Yeah." So that's just a legacy for me. Ryan Lapointe, you're next. Ryan? People writing their name, but not like following up. Ryan, if you're not here, we'll move on. Let's move on to Jackson Hall.
Hi, Bao. So yeah, I'm Jackson Hall. I'm in the directing track and a senior here at UVU. And so I've done some of my own like documentary, shorter documentary stuff before. And something that I've noticed is generally with documentaries, you kind of discover the story you want to tell as you go along. Obviously, you go in with a plan and everything, but you had a very strong narrative and a bold direction about sort of the racism in Hollywood and how it's super difficult for non-whites to make it to be a big star in Hollywood or a big producer, director, to have a big influence in Hollywood. Was that something you sort of discovered along the way as you were making this film about this biography about Bruce Lee, or was that something that you initially had planned?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jackson. I mean, for me, like, yeah, the best documentaries there's a sense of discovery, especially with the audience, right? I think it was this film, because it's based on a historical figure, and I had done a lot of research before, it was less of a discovery for me. I think the moments where the film sort of transitions or pivots to social issues and sort of the larger social context of where Bruce Lee was in America at that time, they were less surprising because I knew about all those things. But I hadn't related it to Bruce Lee's life, right? And so those connections felt more like a discovery. I would say that, how I started with the process of making the film is that I initially sort of did like a paper edit or radio edit of all the times that Bruce Lee had spoke, be it in a film, be it in an interview, and even when he wrote something. And I wanted Bruce Lee to tell as much of his own story as possible. And after that, I thought I'm gonna build the other. Those are that's the bones of the story, and then the muscles and the fat and things were the other interviews, the stories of other people, and the stories from the other people, the other interview subjects who knew Bruce very well. That was the discovery process, right? That was, you've read, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar talking about Bruce Lee in like a quote that's less than a paragraph, but when you spend 2 or 3 hours interviewing people about Bruce Lee, then there's that sense of discovery. And I think the interview that was the most eye-opening for me, and I think you can make an entire film out of it, was his first love in America, Amy Sanbo, his Japanese American girlfriend. And we literally spoke to her for 4 hours. And but when you're obviously when you're making a documentary, you sort of edit it down to a couple of minutes, which is a shame, right? But the things that I discovered about, and I included it in the film, that Bruce's sense of identity, when he came in as a Asian, right? He came from Hong Kong, and then he met Amy, but he he was trying to think of what it meant to be American, and she taught him essentially that you can be Asian American, that is an identity on its own. And I think that was so formative to who he became for the rest of his life. And also, I think we can all relate to heartbreak. And I was like thinking of Bruce Lee going through a breakup, being heartbroken, and then having to transition and pivot to a different ambition. That's when he met Linda, but he also met Linda because he decided to open up his school more. So if he stayed with Amy, if Amy didn't break up with him and they got married, then they could be living in like Flagstaff, Arizona, where Amy currently lives, and Bruce Lee could just be running a martial arts studio in Flagstaff and not be Bruce Lee. So it's those are the interesting points that you sort of think about, but they are something that is very great about making documentaries, right? I think that's the most beautiful part about making documentaries, is about having that sense of discovery and also sort of going to a place that you don't necessarily belong to and exploring that story.
Awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed your movie, and thank you for answering my question.
Of course, thank you.
All right, Mr. Roan Oberg.
Hi, Bao. Hi, Go. Thank you guys so much for joining us. My name's Roan, and I'm a junior at UVU. And my question is, you open up the documentary by starting in the 70s when he goes back to Hong Kong after having lived in America, and then you go back 12 years earlier. What motivated that decision rather than just opening the movie from the start and telling it more from a linear fashion?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Roan. I would say, for me, I always, you start off with a linear structure usually when you're making a film, and just because that's a way for you to comprehend the story as well as possible. But I always find it boring and predictable. So as much as you can kind of stray away from linear storytelling, that's something I recommend. And with Bruce Lee, since he's such a big star, and I wanted to sort of have the audience enter the story at the place that most people know Bruce Lee as, like this big star in a way, right? So that being most people's entry point, that would be the entry point for the film. And from there, we sort of unpack all that, right? And we go backwards and forwards, and then it becomes it's almost like for me, I think of it as Bruce's like coming of age film in many ways, or origin story. But you I think it's more powerful when you sort of like understand where sort of his apex of his career, and then kind of dismantle that or deconstruct that a bit more. I should say, the film, the first cut of the film moved around a lot more in terms of time and place and time, but audience, some of our producers who didn't know Bruce Lee's story so well, they were a bit confused. And I think clarity, even though you're making, it's an artistic endeavor, if there's not clarity and understanding of the story, then all the sort of artistic license and cinematic language that you're trying to employ is almost moot, because people will just get lost and they won't understand what's going on. So then they have no anchor. So we had to make sure that there was an anchor that the audience could hold on to, but then stray away, but always going back to that anchor when necessary.
Thank you. You also mentioned kind of how you were, how in the first cut you were jumping around a bit more, and you also mentioned how you got a lot more content from the people you were interviewing. And sort of hypothetically, if you were to say make like an extended cut, or say make like a B Water 2, what are some other elements you would want to include that weren't in this version?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that question. As I mentioned earlier, just I think Bruce's sort of love story with Amy, it was a bit interesting. I mean, she sort of gets into the weeds of his romantic style, for the lack of a better term, and I was like, oh, I wish I could put it in there, but it's not. You always have to, when you're making a film that you're dealing with a lot of material, you have to go back to what the thesis of your film is, right? Because people are like, oh, why didn't you include this? Why didn't you include that? Because that's why I don't consider it a definitive film. And that's why I don't like to make films that are definitive, because then it's like, are you, as a filmmaker, one of your jobs in a way is to find meaning in someone's story, and not their entire, every single, in the span of entire person's life, not every single event is, for the, not a, it's not meaningful to that particular film, right? It's not relevant. And so how do you always bring back those events, and what does it mean? What are you trying to say thematically with the film? And so, like, the scenes that I included thematically were important to talking about Bruce Lee as an Asian American struggling in Hollywood, right? I always have to go back to that idea. There was a funny story of, like, he was such a hardcore fitness guy that he would have a sandwich in one hand and a dumbbell in the other, and that's like a very adorable story and like a great image of Bruce Lee, but it's sort of, it really changes the trajectory of the plot and the structure. So I was like, well, maybe that'll be, a blooper reel or something like that.
Awesome. Thank you for answering my questions. And I really enjoyed it, by the way. I loved it.
All right. Thank you.
All right, Kirsten Sorensen.
All right. Hi, I'm Kirsten Sorensen. I'm in the editing path at UVU right now. I loved your movie, and I have a question, but I'm not sure how involved you were with this part. But I guess you've been talking about how you were searching for people for interviews, so you might know how to answer this question. But one part of the movie I really liked was that you got to interview like Bruce Lee's students and friends, and I thought that was like really cool. I hadn't even thought about that. So I guess my first question is like, what inspired you to reach out to the students, and also how did you like find them, basically? So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I was, as a director, you have to be involved in everything. I was also one of the producers of the film as well, and I wanted, I can, a very practical way to answer that question is that there's not that many people who are alive who still know Bruce Lee. And so there are only a few students left, there are only a few friends left. So we basically tried to interview everyone that was alive that knew him. But he also, in the film, you can tell that he lived a lot of sort of different lives over his lifespan, right? He was a teacher, he was obviously a father, he was a movie star. And so that I made sure that we were sort of talking to people who could speak to each orbit, right? And so we can get somewhat of a more whole picture of who he was as a person. And I think him coming to America, in the late 1950s, the first people he met became his students, and then his friends. And so I think you think of like points of someone's life and points of the story that are so pivotal to what you're trying to say, and you want to make sure that you talk to as many people that encapsulate and that encompasses that life, that occupy that space in his life. And so we spoke to everyone that we knew that was alive, that knew him in Seattle in his early years, and also trying to talk to people that have never really spoken about him before. And it's funny because people are so, this is not, I hope I don't sound ageist in any way, but there's a lot of interview subjects that were very old, and they didn't have email, they didn't have cell phones. We literally had to find a landline for them. And it's a bit of detective work trying to find out where they are, if they're going to show up for an interview. Like, you leave a voicemail and just pray that they would come, because Leroy, who's in the film, who was one of his first students, he lived like 2 hours away from Seattle, and he was a total recluse. Now he's a total recluse, and people are like, good luck trying to get an interview with him. And we went to Seattle, and we called him the night before and then the morning of, and just praying that he would come. And then he came on time. He had, his pickup truck, and he spent like 3 hours talking about like guns and hunting. And then we used about like 2 minutes of him talking about Bruce Lee. Yeah. So it's definitely a lot of detective work that you have to do if they're, especially if they're older subjects that are harder to reach.
Yeah. Yeah, part of the reason I want to ask that is because you mentioned that like a lot of other documentaries ask famous people that maybe briefly knew him. So I thought it was like really clever and awesome that you were able to reach out to people who probably knew the real him. So it really helped humanize him for me. So yeah, thank you for this movie, basically.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we've got Tyler Mckinnon.
Hi, I'm a senior here and I'm studying screenwriting. Thanks so much for doing this. This is super awesome. I was really touched by this. I thought it was really cool to see, it wasn't just a documentary about Bruce Lee as a star, but as a human being. And yeah, I wish I had a more interesting question, because I've just been thinking it, like I've just been processing this film still. But I was just really impressed with like the scope that you were able to cover in this documentary, that I feel as if I've been mentored by him just by watching this. And I think that's really like a unique, I think any film that can, you can walk away having become a little better is always, a huge achievement. And so I guess my question kind of deals with structuring and editing, and the storytelling of it. The question is how, because like I mentioned, you cover the racist history, Hollywood in general, Bruce Lee's life, and all these things. Was there any conscious decisions in the way you structured this narrative, where it's like, well, we definitely want to talk about, this history here, or put this here? Because there's nice bookend, beginning and end with a daughter, which I thought was really cool. Was there any conscious decisions that you made in the structure that really, I don't know, kind of made it sing more for you?
So yeah, great question. With documentaries, you might often hear that those films are like made in the editing room, right? Because you're basically you shoot all these footage, you shoot interviews, and you get this big lump of clay, and then in the edit, you're sculpting it. And I had an idea of like which subjects and which social contextual history would work with parts of his life, but it always took, like, you have to watch and rewatch things over and over again to get that right feel and just get the tone and the pacing right, and you almost become numb. I really recommend for filmmakers to like definitely, even though you think you have to like work 24/7 7 days a week, or 24 hours a day 7 days a week, having like that day off just to walk away from your project and to clear your mind and then go back and rewatch it is so important, because otherwise, again, you get numb. You've been watching it over and over again, and you don't feel any emotion anymore. And for me, when we were sort of editing the social context scenes and his life, we always wanted to make sure that there was this right balance between like whatever we were saying about history at that time, there was a relationship to Bruce Lee, and that we weren't straying away from Bruce's story too much, because then it turns a bit, it turns into like a lecture almost. We didn't want it to be we wanted it to be a history lesson in some ways, but we didn't want people to feel like they were watching a history documentary. We wanted it always just enough for people to understand the context, and then once they felt like just at the point where they felt like it was too much, we would go back to Bruce's story. And that's, very, it's a lot of finessing in the edit to make sure that you're always doing that it doesn't feel too heavy one way or the other. And that always, it keeps the audience on their toes, right? Especially in documentary, because they want to feel like they know where they're going, but at the moment that they feel surprised, it's really kind of the magic of cinema in many ways. Like, I always think, yeah, you have like this 3-act structure, but and people, just intuitively understand that 3-act structure, and there's a reason that people have been using that structure for so long. But when you stray away just briefly, it surprises an audience, and I always like to make films that sort of surprise audiences, even if it's very subtle. It's, I'm not trying to do like a huge twist or anything, but just like it just keeps people engaged.
No, I loved it. It felt like in the best way possible, like I was watching a eulogy. It was really beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we now have Ephraim Belknap.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yep.
All right, cool. The question I had is this. So I'm kind of a martial arts fan, and Bruce Lee is one of the big reference points for that. But of course, when you start learning actual martial arts like karate or boxing or anything, you end up talking about Bruce Lee a lot, and you realize there's kind of some misinformation out there. He can do a lot of cool things, but also, it's like he couldn't beat anybody in the world ever, sadly. Were there any misconceptions about Bruce Lee in popular culture that you wanted to clear up with this film, with this documentary, because you knew it was about him and was going to reach a wide audience?
I went, again, I wanted the film to be about Bruce Lee's life in his present day, right? So then that gave me sort of a lot of leeway to not have to deal with these debates that happen in his death, right? Because you can get sucked into a dark hole of these debates, and like, oh, why is Bruce, his impact on MMA and his impact on sort of martial arts cinema, and it's like, that's a whole nother film. So I think as a filmmaker, and in the case of this film, I wanted to be almost laser focused on like, this is about Bruce Lee's life while he lived it, and even more so like him as an Asian American traveling through the context of America at that time. I mean, you can, for yourself as someone who's an admirer of martial arts, it doesn't really get into the martial arts that much either, right? And that was never the intention of the film. And so if people were like, oh, why didn't you talk about, the Wong Jackman fight or things like that, and like more about his fighting philosophy or why he never like really competed, I was like, well, the film doesn't talk about that for a reason. If I even tried to talk about that and didn't really, and it just kind of scratched the surface of it, that would be very problematic for me. And that's why, not to say I'm trying to like avoid it, but what the narrative that I wanted to tell Bruce Lee was what was presented in Be Water. And I think that was my strongest case for making the film, is that that this is my version of a Bruce Lee film. And I hope people, again, as Duane pointed out, he pointed out the definitive, but I don't think of it as definitive. And I hope generations retell stories and not just a Bruce Lee story, but everyone's story. Like we're filmmakers, we're storytellers. We all should reshape stories in the way that we feel like it's authentic and honest to how we see it.
Cool. Thanks. That was very helpful. I mean, we have versions of Bruce Lee in so many fictionalized movies, like the Ip Man movies and Legend of Bruce Lee and all that, and they always feel a little inauthentic, but this felt very authentic, and it was really great. Appreciated it. So.
Excellent. Now we are going to Ethan Knowlton. We have, I think we have like 3 more questions. Does that sound good for you, Bao? Are you doing all right?
Sure. And if people have any questions for Go, not that they would go under the bus, but or anything about our collaboration, please feel free.
Hello. Thank you. That was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I grew up watching 30 for 30s, and so that's kind of the reason I'm in this class. And so I really enjoyed that film. And in that context, I was also wondering, working with ESPN, how much do you feel like you were able to execute your own vision, and how much like did you get a lot of feedback from them? Did they kind of just check in with you every once in a while? What was that process like working with them?
Yeah, so I mean, to go back to one of Joan's earlier questions about like how the film kind of came about, the reason I decided to go with ESPN after having other offers is that I love the 30 for 30 series, and one of the things I love about the 30 for 30 series is that each film is very much different film. Even though there's sort of the DNA of a 30 for 30, you can tell that this is driven by the director, right? And that's, you want that when you're negotiating and you're working with a big broadcaster like ESPN. You want that creative freedom. So that was one of the main reasons I decided to go with ESPN. And I spoke to several directors that had worked with them, and they're like, yeah, they're very, again, director driven, and they're pretty hands off. And they didn't, it wasn't until we got into like the first cut that, of course, we shared that with them, and they made suggestions. They never call it like that these are like things that you have to change, but suggestions really for clarity. They know their audience better than anyone else. They know who's watching. And to be honest, I watch 30 for 30s, but I'm not the typical like ESPN viewer. And so I understand that sort of negotiation that you have to make with who is broadcasting your project. And again, as I mentioned earlier, like the idea of clarity for the audience is so important, and that they understand the story, that they're not lost along the way because you're trying to do something like clever with the editing or clever with the storytelling. And those were mostly the notes that ESPN had. It was just like clarity and like, oh, why is this person here? Like what does this event mean? Like, or what is this person referring to? And again, when you're watching cuts so many times, the first time you watch something is when you feel like you don't know what's going on, or you're having that sense of discovery. But after you're watching it for the 30th time, you sort of forget what you don't know, right? And so that's always having someone watch it for the first time is helpful, because they can just give you that sort of baseline information that you need as a viewer.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Also, are you on Twitter? Because I'll give you a follow.
Okay, yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter that much, but I'm on Twitter and Instagram. So it's I'll put it in the chat, I guess. But it's BAO M as in Mary, NGUYEN.
All right, awesome. And good job on the score. I always knew you were a talented musician after watching Daylight Savings. So
Thank you. A little trivia is the project that I did before this film was actually scoring a diabetes medication commercial similar to the movie.
that's awesome.
All right. Okay, who do we got next? Allison Guzman.
Hi, hi Go, hi Bao. I'm Allison. I'm a junior at UVU. I'm going through the editing track. I had a question actually for both of you. From what I heard before, it sounds like you kind of had the idea going into it that you wanted the story to be focused on the Asian American struggle. And as for the score, did you kind of want it to be, I guess, did you want it to support that kind of like melancholy feeling, or did you, like, how did you go into it? And with collaborating, did you guys both like watch it through and change some things? I'm sure you did, but the overall like mood of the film, what kind of like mood were you looking for, and how was that accomplished like with the score?
Sure. Thank you, Allison, for asking the question. I'll just quickly give my kind of answer to that, and then Go, please jump in. We had a very long kind of conversation and long collaboration. I mean, up until, God, I don't know how long we worked on the film together, Go, but just the early conversation was like, I wanted the film to have gravitas, right? It was important to me that Bruce's story felt like he was an important and pivotal figure, that it wasn't just sort of he's a kung fu guy and you're gonna play music that's like very actiony, even though we do kind of get into that in certain scenes. But I think I always wanted, for me, like melancholic music, there's a sense of seriousness to it that I never felt was used in Bruce Lee's story before. It was all, you know, the other films were a bit campy and like poppy, and I just felt that this is, as someone put it, it's like, I didn't want it to feel like a eulogy, but I think that's actually a great way to put it, in a way that the film is like a eulogy. It kind of did its job, because I think Bruce Lee's story is very tragic, right? It's a tragedy. He dies at the prime of his life, right before he's really able to experience his dream to be a Hollywood star. And I think I wanted the music to reflect that. And I'll let Go answer.
Yeah, Bao got me involved pretty early on, most of last year. I think it was, I started in like May.
Well, most of 2019, last year is 2020. We forget.
Oh yeah, God,
Yeah.
a lot of it. Right, most of 2019, some of 2020, and I think you were wanting some stuff that was reminiscent of like 1960s pop, and also canto pop. So I was doing some research, and then I don't think any of that really got used, to be honest, because it was too much of a pastiche, maybe. So then I just kind of went more towards like sort of like an orchestral kind of thing, but more dreamy kind of. I think we were even talking about we're going to try to license that song California Dreaming and My Way, Frank Sinatra, since that was his favorite song. So there's some, obviously I can't cover that song, you know, but I was using kind of elements of the shape of the melody for some of it, and just kind of disguising it. And yeah, it just was just kind of chipping away at it for like a year and just sort of seeing what stuck. And yeah.
That I'd like to ask, to follow on that, what was the sort of beginning to end length of this process, from like your beginning where you were just working on it to finish, and then from like the moments like when ESPN came involved to finish?
I mean, literal dates, I guess 2015, summer of 2015 was when I first came out with the idea. You know, I talked to Shannon that summer, sort of like, we're just talking for a long time. I was like writing, I had like a 40-page script, I would say, and that kind of writing that on and off for a year, trying to find funding, and then sort of losing that relationship with Shannon about in year 2, and then year 3, I was kind of down in the dumps about the project, and that's when my producer like, let's talk to ESPN. And so I think, God, it wasn't until 2018, summer of 2018, that we talked to ESPN and we got them to come on board, and we started really full throttle on the film. You know, all of 2019 was dedicated to the film. and then it premiered at Sundance of January 2020.
Great. Thanks a lot. That's a good context. Allison has a follow-up question she wants to ask.
Sorry, it's not a question. I just wanted to add something really fast. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the film, and as an Asian American myself, I found that it was really eye-opening, and I think one of the most important things about film is like being able to step into shoes that you wouldn't normally be able to step into. And I think just in light of everything that's going on in the world right now in the Asian American community, stories like this are like really important, and I just really appreciate it. So I just want to say thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
saying that.
Thank you, Allison.
Okay, I got two more questions, if that's cool. We got Annie McAllister decided she did have a question. She was our first person. Are you still with us, Annie?
Yeah. Okay. So I like now I have three, but I'll just try to go with one. Or maybe I could ask three and you pick the one you like the most, that you want to answer the most. So I thought that I had no idea that he was a child actor, and that footage was really, really cool and fascinating and beautiful. And I was wondering if that was something that you probably knew in your research and had seen some of that, or was that new for you?
So yeah, I mean, I think I knew a lot of Bruce Lee's story beforehand, at least sort of like the cursory points of his life, and him being a child actor was one that I knew about because it was pretty much all of his Hong Kong life. But I think I didn't realize how important his sort of the performative qualities that he learned when he was younger, and how that would kind of play into him being a martial artist and sort of, as Amy called him, a kinetic genius, right? There's a bit of like, again, coming of age of like, this Bruce Lee wasn't just, I mean, he was a kinetic genius, but I think it came from like him being able to be a performer for most of his youth, and also being the child of a very famous Cantonese opera singer.
So cool. And then I don't know if you want to answer either of these, but I wanted to know, like, what, aside from having to, communicate with people who weren't using modern forms of communication, or getting in communication with the daughter, what were like the most frustrating things in the whole process? And the other one is, would you be willing to share any more of the Amy conversation? Because that sounds really awesome and interesting.
Sure, I'll just answer them very quickly. I mean, one of the most difficult parts of the film, making the film, is that there's not that much archival of Bruce Lee. I mean, we live in a day and age where everyone's recording everything all the time, but this is 1960s America, and Bruce Lee wasn't a huge star at that time, and so there was just like a few press conferences. The only real interview that he ever did was the Pierre Burton one, which I use a lot in the film, the black and white one, and that's like 26 minutes long. And so when you're making a documentary about one person, and the only thing you really have to build around like his own sort of inner monologue, or for him to express his thoughts, is a 26-minute interview, it's very difficult. And so that was very challenging. With Amy, God, what other stories? That could, again, that makes it a whole nother film. I mean, she just talked about how nerdy of a university student Bruce Lee was. And so even though he's turned into like an international sex symbol, he came being just like a really nerdy kid who was just felt really out of place at University of Washington. So I think that's, I think we can all kind of relate to that idea, like going to a new place and feeling awkward. But now, if Bruce Lee can be awkward, then anyone can be awkward.
Yeah, there's hope for all of us. Excellent. I have one last question from Dio Reyes. You with us, Dio? know you're here. No? Dio, did you leave? Okay, well, I don't see him. Well, Bao, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. And Go, for a cameo from you. That was fantastic. Thanks for popping in. It's great to see you. And great to see you again. And it's a beautiful movie. I think a lot of people here who are praising it don't know much about Bruce Lee. So, you know, people who are just kind of watching just because they have to, I think are being, you know, touched and moved. And that says a lot about your filmmaking. I think it was just an exceptional job. Thanks so much for sharing.
Well, thank you, Duane, for having me. Thank you all for joining. I think, you know, Allison mentioned, you know, given the events, and Duane, you mentioned it too, like events of yesterday, and how, you know, Bruce Lee was always trying to fight these stereotypes, these negative stereotypes of Asian Americans. And when you all go forward telling stories and becoming filmmakers and or whatever vocation you choose, like, just I hope we all think about the stories that we choose to tell and how we portray people, especially people who have been historically marginalized, and what do we owe, what privilege do we have to be able to tell those stories, and what do we owe to take care of those stories and take care of how people are depicted, because what we create, these narratives that we create today, they permeate into society, and given they create negative, they create positive portrayals. But I think for us, we always want to create something that's multifaceted, and no one is, you know, no culture is a monolith. Asian Americans aren't a monolith. And how do we do our part in the little ways possible to kind of make a more equitable and representational society, right?
Amen, man. That's awesome. Thank you so much. What a great way to end this night. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see everyone later. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Thanks, Duane.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.